Mama don't allow no architecture around here. Mama don't allow no architecture around here. Oh, I don't care what Mama don't allow, gonna draw mine modern anyhow. Mama don't allow no architecture around here. Well, Mama don't allow no modern houses going on. Mama don't allow no modern houses going on. Oh, I don't care what Mama don't allow, gonna love my modern anyhow. Mama don't allow no modern houses going on.
Welcome to US Modernist Radio. Join George Smart and Frank King as they talk and laugh with people who enjoy, own, create, dream about, preserve, love, and hate modernist architecture, the most exciting and controversial buildings in the world. Support the show by going to patreon.com/US Modernist Radio for all kinds of fun incentives to shamelessly empty your wallet. Today, US Modernist Radio is all about real estate, featuring Los Angeles Uber agent Crosby Doe and Triangle area broker Emilie Huin. And now, your host of the podcast sweeping the nation like a dusty tumbleweed, George Smart and Frank King.
Welcome to the show. I'm George Smart.
I'm Frank King.
US Modernist Radio is underwritten by modboxusa.com. Turn your mailbox into a modbox with one of Modbox USA's colorful, stylish, retro, mid-century modern mailboxes that complements your home's modern aesthetic and turns mail time into party time. See one now at modboxusa.com. And by Sarah Sonk. When it's time to sell your modernist home, listing on MLS alone isn't enough. Reach out to an agent who loves modernist houses with the expertise, experience, and track record to close your deal. She's Sarah Sonk, 919-601-7339. And now here's Frank with the Modernist News.
Alrighty, Dateline Copenhagen. I believe it's Copenhagen if it's dipping tobacco. C.F. Muller has unveiled designs for Denmark's largest sewage pumping station. Well, don't you know his parents are proud. Planned to be built on Copenhagen's Clovermarken. According to architects, the brick station aims to, quote, set new standards for large-scale sustainable utilities in Danish cities, end quote, while, quote, closely integrating itself into the dense urban context. Dense urban context. How do you say, what does that smell in Danish? It will be built as a circular structure, turns out the optimal shape of an underground pumping well, and feature 2 rainwater harvesting green roofs, a distinctive set of 24-meter tall pressure towers, and 2 recreational gardens for employees. No mention of what sort of recreation. My guess, the cornhole game. And finally, Dateline Seattle. Like most kids, architect Jeffrey Pelletier was a big fan of Legos as a child, but unlike most kids, he never gave up playing with the colorful toys. Now he's amassed a collection of, get this, 250,000 of them, which he sorts by size and color. I'll take obsessive compulsive disorder for 1,000, Alex. He keeps them in the basement of his family's 1902 Seattle house, where I'm guessing he still lives with his mother. Thank you.
Thank you, Frank.
Thank you.
So an episode or two ago, we talked with the son of the architect of Frank's childhood home,
Milton Small.
Milton Small. And it also turns out that Tom Guild grew up in a modernist house, right, Tom?
Yes, I gather that I did.
So where was it and who put it together?
Yeah, well, it was over in Durham, in Duke Forest. My dad was on the faculty there, and George Birmingham built it with probably with some help from my dad, I think. I didn't.
Was your dad an architect, Tom?
He was a professor of biochemistry.
Close enough.
Of course. Sure. I mean, it was a great house. And the funny thing is that, it's a shape. It was on a sloping lot, so it had a daylight basement, lots of windows, huge, great picture window in the back that overlooked the woods. The birds would always fly into the picture window and drop another story, and then my cat would be in the bushes waiting. And there was the thing is, I remember there were on the block. This is on McDowell Street. There was maybe one house on the street, period, that was sort of like the kind you see in North Raleigh all the time now, fake colonial, Williamsburgy architecture. And I remember thinking how funny that house looked when I was little. And I realize now I probably live in a house like that. But it was great.
Yeah, when you live in a modernist house, everything else looks weird. Right?
Yes.
Who was the builder, Tom?
George Birmingham.
Oh, yeah.
He was a real fixture down there in Durham in the early 60s. He built like half the houses on my street, it seemed like. And then later on, he had a second career as...
Yeah, George Birmingham was the go-to guy for home inspections in the 80s and 90s. If you were a buyer, you wanted George crawling under your house because he would find everything that was possibly wrong with that building, as you experienced, Tom, right?
Yes, he did inspect a house I bought in Durham in 1980 and found a lot of stuff, and I'm really glad he did. And I don't think he was around when I finally sold the house. Thank goodness.
Well, that takes us to our great guest today. First off, Crosby Doe, LA's special agent for modernist houses. Crosby began his career in real estate in 1973, and his first sale was a Richard Neutra design, which inspired him to pursue the specialized niche of architect design real estate. He's helped well-known people such as Joel Silver, Diane Keaton, and Kelly Lynch, but beyond sales, he is respected as a historian and preservationist of California's most important modernist properties. Welcome, Crosby.
Greetings.
And we have Chapel Hill realtor Emilie Huin, who grew up in Ithaca, New York. She caught the modernist bug early, growing up and spending time at the idyllic modernist estate of Cornell's Dean of Architecture, John Clare Miller. Then she moved at 10 to modernist-rich Sarasota, Florida, home of architects such as Paul Rudolph and Ralph Twitchell and Jean Leedy. With a degree in art history, for 8 months she sold huge amounts of liposuction and laser devices and then became national accounts manager for the Ritz-Carlton. In 2009, she and her husband Alexander bought their modernist house in North Carolina, and by 2011, she was a real estate agent, within a few years becoming one of the leading modernist agents in the entire state. So welcome, Emilie.
Thank you.
So Crosby, tell us about that first Neutra house. How did that steer your career?
Well, at the time, looking way back, I had just entered the real estate industry and was advised that I needed to call everybody within a certain area up in the Hollywood Hills, and I proceeded to do that in the evenings, and had one gentleman who said he was interested in speaking with me, and it turned out to be a gentleman by the name of Eugene Loring, who was actually a dancer. His real name was Leroy Kapperstein, but his stage name was Eugene Loring, and he had just gotten a professorship at the newly opened University of California at Irvine, and thus he needed to sell his house that he had designed or had Richard Neutra design. It was a wonderful house up on in the Hollywood Hills, just one bedroom and a den, and I had previous to that time just been concentrating on an area location, but as I represented that property, and it gave me the opportunity to meet for the first time a very famous architectural photographer by the name of Julius Schulman.
Yes.
I hired Julius, and that commenced a lifelong friendship. But additionally, what was amazing was when I was sitting in that house, having open houses, it just came to me that I was feeling good, and I was wondering why I was feeling so good, and ultimately it came to me that it was the house and the relationship of the house to the land and to the nature surrounding it. And right about the same time, I ran across another small little book called A Guide to Architecture in Southern California, which was published by the Los Angeles County Museum of Art. And a light bulb went off. I said, gee, there are a lot of these houses. Who would want to represent ordinary houses? And one by one, it established a career. And in L.A. today, almost, I would say, an industry.
And you've sold quite a number of very famous houses by Frank Lloyd Wright, by his son Lloyd Wright, John Lautner, Bruce Goff, Wallace Neff. Tell us about some of those. I mean, they're just showcase houses that you've had a chance to not only be involved in, but help save.
Well, it's been a great honor, and at the same time, a real challenge, especially recently. We've recently sold, I think for the second time. The first time I sold the Storer house, it was to Joel Silver, and that was a rather remarkable sale. Joel had just come from back east in your area to California to commence his movie career, and he had a passion for Frank Lloyd Wright, and basically he wanted the house, and he had a bunch of high-powered business managers, and they brought in the business managers, the accountants, the structural engineers, and home inspectors, and it was quite a meeting in Lloyd Wright's studio where my office was at the time, and the structural engineer said, "Joel, don't buy this house, it's going to fall down on you and kill you," and the business manager said, "Joel, if you buy this house, I'm going to quit as your business manager," and there was all types of negativity, and fortunately, or amazingly, Joel said, "You guys don't know what you're talking about. This is Frank Lloyd Wright. I'm going to buy it. I'm going to restore it." And literally, he was such a good salesman, quite frankly, that not only did the business manager not quit, but he went in as partners on Albrecht back east there, another Frank Lloyd Wright. As a matter of fact, it's a Frank Lloyd Wright plantation. So that started it, and recently we've managed to sell the property again. And these houses are quite a challenge because they were so experimental to build. And fortunately, we hope we have the right person for this one now. We think so.
Emily, do you hear that a lot from prospective buyers, that their family and friends go, no, don't buy that modernist house?
Sure. There are plenty of people who don't understand what they're looking at and, have some trepidation as to whether it's a good investment for, their family members. Or I think there's a lot of confusion maybe over the style and whether or not they can envision their family members in the house. So, yeah, we definitely do, especially for the older ones that need quite a bit of rehabbing. There's always that trepidation as to what that's going to entail.
So what are some of the biggest misconceptions, Emily, about buying a modernist house? I mean, what information out there is wrong about it?
I think people are generally quite intimidated because they don't know what they're getting into with, especially with the mid-century properties, what is going to happen when they open up the walls. And a lot of them don't have the connections in terms of builders or architects to help guide them through that process. And so that ends up, I end up doing a lot of matchmaking, I guess, in that sense, to help someone who does see potential in a house be able to kind of realize that with the support that they need to make it happen.
So when people come to you in the Chapel Hill area, are the buyers like already into this, or do they just sort of discover it by accident and go, I could live here?
There's definitely a mix of both. I think there's been a trend towards people who decidedly went modern. I've seen a lot more of that. But I think through the North Carolina Modernist Houses site, a lot of people sort of become aware of what exists in the area, and it drives their interest. And, they kind of get excited about the possibility of something new and a new way of living.
So is it typical that you've got, let's say, two spouses, and one spouse is into it and the other one's going, I don't know, honey.
Sure. Absolutely. That second spouse is always the hardest sell.
Because my wife was that way, and through the proven George Smart brainwashing program, she was able to come around to the style, and now we're in a very nice home. Crosby, out in L.A., modernism has really never fallen out of style completely because it's been so fueled by the entertainment industry and the design industry out there. I'm thinking in particular the Newman House that you were involved in that was really quite a save.
Well, the Newman House actually was designed by Lloyd Wright and built for the Newman family. Alfred Newman was a conductor and music writer for the industry, and it was built quite uniquely on the site in Santa Monica Canyon, and I was honored to represent it by the Newman family when the wife had finally passed away, and it was purchased by Diane Keaton, and we had. She did a number of things that I approved of and some that I didn't. So oftentimes it's a matter of educating people that a lot of these classic icons are going to be most valuable when you preserve them with their original historic fabric rather than trying to make them something more contemporary.
And Diane Keaton is one of those serial modernists, right? She had more than one of these homes.
Well, she did own 2 Lloyd Wrights.
Yes. And is she still into that, or has she moved on to something else?
Well, I think that for the time being, she seems to be out of modernism and has moved back into the earlier period revival houses.
That's kind of unusual because usually once somebody drinks the modernism Kool-Aid, that's it. The story's over, right? I mean,
well, it does change you, and I would tend to agree as a general rule.
I've noticed, Crosby, that across the country, most of the preservation organizations tend to hold realtors kind of at arm's length, when realtors are often a really key ingredient to making sure a house doesn't get destroyed. But you've been able to cross over in that and really become an integral part of preservation efforts in L.A. How has that come about?
Well, that's interesting. I think that when I started the career, as you had mentioned back in the 70s, it was amazing to me, having grown up in Pasadena in an area of fine old homes. It's very fortunate that most of them were preserved. And I guess the preservation movement was just beginning. But within the real estate industry itself, it seemed like there was a lot of resistance to preservation. People almost here on the West Coast tied it in with socialism, and we're not going to have anybody telling us what to do with our properties. So there was a great resistance. But over time, with education, the community kind of really, what would I say? They became much more open to the benefits of preservation and the importance of it. And then the state of California passed some legislation that allowed for tax benefits. And now the industry has pretty much embraced it wholeheartedly.
It's huge out there. I mean, it's on the edge of every cultural event and art and design. It's amazing.
Exactly. And finally, I think that people are recognizing that properties that maintain their original historic fabric are the most valuable, just like a classic Duesenberg or something of that nature. People more and more are looking for houses that haven't been completely altered.
So this is a question for both of you. I know here, when we're dealing with a very key modernist house, they're often unrealistic sellers who imagine that it's still 2008 and their house should be worth a fortune, and it's not. So how do you persuade them to what a reasonable value for their house is so that it can be quickly sold and hopefully saved?
Well, there's certainly some people that have inflated ideas of what they can get for their modernist home because, you know, they're so unique and they're gems, and they are sure that there's someone out there who will swoop in and pay top dollar, probably cash. You know, that's always what I hear. But I think it really is a matter of education and communication to the sellers that, you know, if they do want to sell their home, you know, they just have to kind of look at sales. And fortunately, we have a number of modernist houses in the Triangle that I can use as comps to explain to them this is sort of what they could sell for, and this is how your house compares to these, and going through that process. And you know, some of them do just need that period of time sitting on the market at a higher price, and to, you know, maybe experience the lack of offers or the lack of showings and then readjust at a later date. You know, it can be a real, you know, personal process, and people are very emotionally attached to these homes. So, you know, I figure between education and just sort of allowing them to take the time to move through it however they need to, you know, we eventually get to the right place and find the right buyer for the home.
I think that was exactly right. And, however, my personal opinion is that any of these recognized modernist pieces that have really been well documented have an art value which has really been undervalued over the years. And quite frankly, it's hard for me to think of any of the properties being overpriced. It's just the market awareness hasn't quite caught up with them. Here in Los Angeles, after the meltdown in 2007, 2008, as you had mentioned, architecture took a hit with all of real estate, but I noticed it the first to come out of the recession. And additionally, now we are getting record high prices, which are literally amazing. I'm not the only one. One of the associates I trained years ago who's moved on to another company had just recently sold a small house by Richard Neutra for $3.4 million. Earlier, I think I'd sold it for a record price of $46,000. So.
And that was just 2 weeks earlier.
I think we're getting an international attention, especially here in Los Angeles, to these properties, and we always allow the owners to at least to give a shot to their property. We never know for sure, and I think that it was quite right that after a while, though, the market will dictate what the ultimate price is.
Crosby, you mentioned that there's a great deal of modernist architecture in California, and I've got to admit that I realize now, my wife and I bought a condo in La Jolla in 1995, and looking back, it was in a modernist building, which didn't occur to me at the time, at least consciously, and I walked into the unit, the entire back wall was glass, a view of Mount Soledad. The thing was, though, the woman who bought it had lived there since 1965. She had done nothing with it but clean it, so it was like a time capsule, and I can remember walking in. They'd had trouble selling it because everybody else who saw it thought, dump. And I walked in and thought, I'm home. So, you know, oftentimes to sell a house, the realtor will stage the house in a certain way. But the modernist house, do you bake the classic chocolate chip cookies, or is there a way that you stage a modernist house that you wouldn't stage just an ordinary faux colonial?
Well, staging is a bit of a bad word in my vocabulary, because I think the architecture generally, any good effort of it, and even the secondary architects, the architecture kind of sings and speaks for itself. It doesn't need a throw over the couch or something of that nature. Each of the, quite frankly, each of the properties, though, is so unique. And sometimes there's inappropriate furniture. that the even original owners had. Sometimes there's painting needed, but generally we try to just let the architecture shine, and we don't worry too much about the cookies or anything of that nature, because it's really the architecture we're selling, and people will flock to that nowadays.
Okay.
So, Emily, when you're dealing with a couple that's looking for a house, and maybe they're not familiar with modernist architecture at all, but they're looking in a community and they see a bunch of different houses, how do you get them to understand the vibe? How do you get them to also overcome all the bad stories that a lot of realtors tell about modernist design, like all flat roofs leak, and that's a weird house, and you don't want to live there, and you'll become weird if you live there, things like that. I mean, how do you educate them? What's that process like?
Sure. I think that's a really good question, because that's definitely a lot of what I end up doing here. Because, as opposed to the modern real estate in Florida or California, I think modern architecture is seen as somewhat more of an anomaly here in North Carolina. We're used to, everyone's used to seeing photos of modernist houses with, palm trees as landscaping, or cacti, or, in these beautiful...
We have one cacti in Durham County. I think that's it.
We can always Photoshop in pine trees.
Yeah.
Right. Well, exactly. And so it's the context, that can seem out of place for some people, I think. And so I think my work as a broker is to really has a lot to do with changing that perception and getting individuals to just look at the special features of each home, trying to move, and also the public perception as well, not just the buyers, but also the real estate agents who are going to be showing the homes that I list. So I think certainly that plays through in the marketing that I try to do for the properties. So to really expand upon the story of the house, not just about the architect that built it, but to sort of paint a picture of, the life of the home and, all of the unique features. So that, that's the focus, as opposed to all the scary things that could go wrong. And, and again, just making sure that all those resources are available to people. If things do go wrong, they know who to call, or they can call me and I can connect them with someone. So that takes a lot of fear and anxiety out of the equation, I think.
How do you get the homeowners and the realtors on sort of the same page together? Because I've noticed that both groups tend to lose the history of these houses. They forget. Sometimes even if an owner has been there for 40 years, they may not remember who designed their house or who built the house. And it's important to establishing the architecture as being the leading component to see if you can connect it with something. Otherwise, you've got a painting with no painter, really.
Sure.
So how does the research factor into this?
Well, I think it's incredibly important to be aware of that. And when I first started in real estate here, I'd come across so many modernist houses that were listed incorrectly in MLS, so people couldn't find them if they searched for a modern home. Realtors couldn't find them if they were searching for a modern home, or there would be no reference to the architect, or the architecture as being unique. So that's definitely something that we focus on, is referring to NCMH to make sure we can identify the architects that built the homes, and communicating to the public in general.
Crosby, do you ever go into a house that's really great and discover that the owner's belongings look like an episode of Hoarders? I mean, it's just stuff everywhere, and you're trying to highlight this brilliant architecture. How do you talk about that to the owners?
Well, I think that is oftentimes a challenge, especially if we're dealing with original owners and people that have been there and loved this for a long time. Although each circumstance is different. Some people will bring up to them, yes, I know I have to get rid of all of these. But even now, one of the properties that we've just listed, a fourplex, a very important fourplex, by Schindler, known as the Falk Apartments here over in Silver Lake.
Sure.
You probably have photographs of it on your site. Is available, and we have 4 tenants with a lot of things that nothing can be done with. But fortunately, Schulman in the archive had photographed the units years ago, and oftentimes we have to go with marketing of historic pictures and photos, especially with people like tenants or properties that are in say relatively difficult conditions. Sometimes we have an owner that's lived there in a house since they built it, and as they get older, they see they don't see everything that needs to be done with the house. So fortunately here, and I think there are archives and historic societies all across the country, we have a great I would say resource to market these properties properly.
So Emily,
Yes.
our crack research team, in cooperation with the NSA, did a little looking into your early career. We discovered you were a medical salesperson selling, it turns out, an award-winning amount of liposuction and laser equipment to doctors. So here's my question. What did you learn in that career that's helpful to real estate? For example, did you learn how unrealistic sellers can perhaps suck the life out of a deal, or
First of all, Frank, I can't believe you found that. So I had I previously I'd worked for GlaxoSmithKline and then in Florida, and then moved up to North Carolina, and was thinking medical sales would be a natural progression. But I realized fairly quickly that it wasn't something I really felt good about selling or believed in. So, I worked about a year there. But what I think, it's a funny question, but I think, in retrospect, I guess I'd have to say that my thoughts regarding plastic surgery maybe mirror my perspective on mid-century architecture renovation.
Oh, we got to hear this. Okay, here we go.
So appreciate what you have. I'd say don't try to turn it into something that it's not. And, just kind of along the lines with NCMH, protect it, preserve it, maybe embrace the change that comes with age, because it adds character. There's nothing worse than, I think a beautiful mid-century home that the kitchen and bathrooms have been renovated with French country cabinets and granite countertops. So it's just, appreciate it for what it is and what it was meant to be. And so that would probably be the single thing
Good answer.
that I could relate.
Well, and one last question for you. And it seems to me as I'm listening to you and Crosby discuss this, and it's almost like a piece of art, the modernist dwelling or the modernist building, in that it needs to be sold properly. Is the word provenance? Is that the word where you can trace a piece of artwork through time? So you could go back to the original architect, and I assume North Carolina modernist homes help you establish provenance on these dwellings so that you can, I assume that helps create the value, along with the comps, but that helps you when you're going to get it financed. Well, look at, Milton Small designed this house. And Is there a process on the provenance?
Absolutely. And I think, that plays a huge piece in the marketing of the property too. Just sort of creating that life around the house. And like as Crosby mentioned earlier, we have fantastic resource, with all of the archival photographs of a lot of these properties. And so, when you walk into a home that someone wants to sell, but it's filled with, puffy leather sectionals and, china closets everywhere, you at least have a reference point with these older photos. Because I think more than anything, what I try to do is to create or recreate an environment that sort of allows for the ideal expression of the original vision for the home. And so more than staging, I try to help, sellers edit things a little bit. Less is definitely more. And so, the archives are certainly incredibly helpful to have.
I want to wrap up talking about two houses in particular, the Silvertop House in Los Angeles and the Cogswell House in Chapel Hill. Crosby, the Silvertop House, designed by John Lautner, is just simply stunning. It's an amazing feat of engineering and site placement and materials, and you were able to sell that one fairly quickly, I understand.
Yes, we were quite fortunate. That was one of my career goals when I first discovered Silvertop in the early 70s. I was rather disappointed that I hadn't known enough at the time to follow foreclosures, because the house was actually bought in a foreclosure sale or a bank sale. And I followed it through the years and was honored last year to be nominated to represent the property. And we devised a marketing campaign where the Wall Street Journal brought the property out the first day. And we literally had people flying in from Korea and from Paris and from Germany, around the world, and it generated great interest. It ultimately sold for well over asking price and more than twice the price of what anything had ever sold for in the area. And coincidentally, though, despite all of the international competition, the owner chose to sell it to a local boy made good, and it's now under restoration.
And that was a neighbor, right?
Yes.
So they just sold it right there, right down the block.
Exactly. Well, she was a wonderful lady. She's since passed away, Jacqueline Burchell. She had a vision for the house and enjoyed it for many years, close to 40 years there. And she was even offered more by one of the bidders, but she liked the family and liked the fact that they lived there in Silver Lake and just wanted them to have it. So I think ultimately she made the right choice.
And in Chapel Hill, Arthur Cogswell was a very well-known architect, quite prolific, did any number of magnificent homes, but some of the best were the houses he designed for himself. One of his early homes was a courtyard-style atrium modernist house made of concrete and steel and was lived in for about 40 years and then became vacant and then got turned over to Emily. And this was not the pristine kind of house that we heard with Silvertop that was going to sell in an instant. So tell us about this story and what happened to the house.
So this was a real exceptional property, especially for the architecture is a bit unique for what we tend to see here in the Triangle. It reminded me a lot of the Sarasota School, flat roofs, different elevations, lots of glass, lots of steel, just absolutely stunning. And the courtyard design was really, really unique. And yeah, I actually, when I moved to the Triangle and we were searching for a home, I would drive past that house constantly. And eventually I ended up calling Arthur Cogswell, who was living at the time, and, asked him about it and, who lived there and what the plans were for the house. His ex-wife lived there, and he connected me with his daughter in Atlanta. And I stayed in touch with her for about 5 years, just wanting to be sure that when the house went for sale, and this was before I was an agent, but that it was transferred to good hands and
Yes.
that it was restored properly, because it's just such a special house. So eventually they did decide to put it on the market, and I was really honored that they did contact me to do that. And we had quite a challenge with the property, though, because it was in such disrepair on a fantastic lot in a really hot neighborhood. And so one of the major concerns was that the house would someone would buy the property for the land and demolish
Sure.
the house. And so that was the last thing that we wanted to have happen. And so certainly, some out-of-the-box marketing needed to take place, and we needed to reach maybe even, beyond the demographic of modernist fans in the area. And so sort of in partnership with North Carolina Modernist Houses, we were able to have, I think the Raleigh News and Observer wrote an article on it, and the Sunday before, we had a huge open house for the property that brought in, I think, around 350, upwards of 350 people. And then they wrote another article afterwards as well, which just got lots of press for the listing. And I think that in conjunction, with some other marketing, there ended up being over 200 showings by real estate agents on that particular property. And we did end up getting multiple offers, all from people who were interested in renovating the house and, keeping kind of true to the original character of the home. And it is now in the hands of a really excited buyer, and they're working with a fantastic architect locally just to really restore it, and we're really excited to see that process take place now.
So with 200 showings,
Yeah.
what was it about this particular buyer that had them grab it, do you think?
Yeah, so she just walked in and she had that feeling of that this is my home. This is where I need to be. I'll do anything I need to do to secure the property and make sure that we're able to restore it properly. And I think that was really important to the daughters of Arthur Cogswell, who designed the home, and
Where they grew up?
Where they grew up, yeah. And so, that to them really meant a lot. And so just knowing that it's in really good hands, and a young family will be moving in there and enjoying it for many, many years to come.
So the couple was seized by the mystic vibe of modernism. It strikes yet again in the hearts of mankind. I want to thank our guest, Crosby Doe. Thanks for being on the show.
Great pleasure. Thank you.
And Emilie Huin, thank you for being here.
My pleasure. Thanks, George.
US Modernist Radio is underwritten by Sarah Sonk, the real estate agent who loves modernist houses just as much as you do. 919-601-7339. And by modboxusa.com and their swanky, colorful, stylish, retro, mid-century modern mailboxes. Thanks for listening. I'm George Smart, and this is Frank King. Take us out, Tom.
That was Frank King. Visit US Modernist Radio on the web at usmodernistradio.org for links about people and buildings mentioned today on the show. US Modernist Radio is recorded at Soundtracks Recording Studios in Raleigh, North Carolina. Our theme song was performed by George Smart and Robinson Earl. Meanwhile, follow us on Twitter at US Modernist or email us at comments@usmodernistradio.org. U.S. Modernist Radio is a production of North Carolina Modernist Houses, a nonprofit educational archive for the documentation, preservation, and promotion of modernist residential design. I'm Tom Guild. George and Frank and I will be back in 2 weeks for another cantilevered, floor-to-ceiling, less is more, concrete and steel edition of U.S. Modernist Radio.